Welcome to today's Explainer. We're taking on something incredibly ambitious today, and I am absolutely thrilled to share it with you. We're going to look at the massive, sprawling 1,500-year history of English literature. But we aren't going to look at it as some dry, boring syllabus of dates and dusty old books. Instead, we're going to view it as a living, breathing entity. Because, literature isn't just a record of history, it's the actual story of human consciousness evolving right alongside massive political, social, and cultural shifts.
Okay, let's dive into this. Consider this quote. Imagine English literature not as a syllabus, but as a long life, with a birth, a rebellious adolescence, a confident adulthood, a midlife crisis, and a restless, still unfolding old age. That is the core metaphor we're going to use throughout this explainer. If we map these historical eras onto the stages of human life, suddenly 15 centuries of complex history become perfectly clear, totally relatable, and deeply fascinating.
So, here's a quick roadmap for us. We'll start with the birth of English literature, move through the Renaissance, into reason, romance, and revolution, hit Victorian doubt, step into the modern world, and wrap up with our global literary conversation.
Chapter 1. The Birth of English Literature. Childhood in the Mead Hall.
Picture this. You're in a dark, smoky mead hall. It's absolutely freezing outside. A bard is chanting by firelight to a room full of hardened warriors. This is literature's infancy, rough, oral, and deeply fatalistic. Our story kicks off around 450 AD. Now, there's no English as we know it yet, just a rough Germanic tongue brought over by Anglo-Saxons and Jutes. Life is brutal and short, and this era gave us our first great hero poem, Beowulf, a massive tale of a warrior fighting monsters and a dragon. But the massive pivot point comes in 1066 AD. William of Normandy crosses the sea, and that French invasion forever alters the trajectory of the English language.
Now, before we leave the Anglo-Saxons, we have to talk about the kenning. Early poetry didn't really bother with rhyme. It just hammered forward with heavy alliteration and these strange, riddling compound words. For example, the sea wasn't just the sea. It was the whale road. The human body? A bone house. It perfectly reflects the dark, indifferent fate these warriors believed in, a powerful looming force they called weird. So, the French arrive in 1066, and the entire social order gets turned on its head. French becomes the language of the court, Latin is the language of the church, and English? English is literally pushed down to the streets and the taverns. But English is stubborn. It survived. It absorbed all those French and Latin words, transitioning into what we now call Middle English. And the man who proved this new English wasn't just some peasant's dialect, was Geoffrey Chaucer. With his incredibly funny, deeply human Canterbury tales, he basically birthed a whole new era of storytelling, completely packed with knights and chivalric romance.
Let's move on and see how this builds in Chapter 2, the Renaissance to the Restoration, the rebellious youth.
If the medieval period was childhood, this era is literature waking up, a lot like a teenager discovering the wider world for the first time. Imagine the bustling, noisy public theaters of Elizabethan London. Trade routes are opening up, the printing press is spreading ideas like wildfire, and humanism is bringing the lost wisdom of ancient Greece and Rome back to life. Under Queen Elizabeth I, we hit a true golden age. William Shakespeare writes plays that will be obsessed over centuries later, alongside brilliant minds like Christopher Marlowe. But, as we know, adolescence has its moody phases. The tone gets noticeably darker in the Jacobean age, with John Donne's brilliantly complex poetry. And then, the storm breaks. Civil War. The Puritans completely shut down the playhouses. And right out of this severe, highly politicized time, the blind poet John Milton writes Paradise Lost, which is arguably English literature's ultimate epic.
But those severe Puritan years just couldn't last forever. In 1660, the monarchy returns, and the theater comes back with a vengeance. Think of the Restoration as literature's wild college years. Puritan gloom is totally out. London demands to laugh, and they want it to be scandalous. Suddenly we've got witty, immoral aristocrats on stage, incredibly sharp satires, and fascinatingly, we get Aphra Behn writing Orinoco, one of the first true novels. She was actually the first woman to earn a living by the pen.
Which brings us to Chapter 3, Reason, Romance, and Revolution. Adulthood's Tug of War.
Here's where we see a massive dramatic tug-of-war as literature hits adulthood. It gets caught between two extreme moods. On one side, we have the Age of Reason, the Augustans. This group admired order, logic, and drawing-room wit. Writers like Alexander Pope and Jonathan Swift used extremely sharp satire to mock society's vanity and human folly. But on the complete opposite side, look at the reaction, Romanticism.
A total, fiery rejection of cold logic in favor of raw passion, the awesome, terrifying power of nature, and wild imagination.
So why did the Romantics rebel so hard? Well, they were utterly intoxicated by the liberty promised by the French Revolution and simultaneously horrified by the ugly, polluting factories of the Industrial Revolution. Wordsworth and Coleridge kick things off with lyrical ballads, arguing that true poetry lives in ordinary rustic lives. Then comes the wildly famous generation of Byron, Shelley, and Keats. Yet, at the exact same time, Jane Austen is writing with surgeon-like precision about the brutal economics of drawing-room manners in marriage. And while all that's happening, a teenager named Mary Shelley combines science and Gothic imagination to dream up Frankenstein. What a ridiculously rich era to have all these minds creating at once.
Moving along to Chapter 4, Victorian Industry and Doubt. The Midlife Crisis. If the previous era was a tug-of-war, this is for sure literature's midlife crisis. Imagine an industrialized, unimaginably wealthy but deeply smoggy and anxious Victorian city. Britain looks incredibly confident on the outside, an empire built on railways and factories, but inside there is deep trouble. Charles Darwin drops on The Origin of Species, throwing the biblical story of creation into total question. The cities are rich, yeah, but they're overflowing with horrific poverty. So how do writers make sense of this massive contradiction? They turn to the novel. The novel becomes the great serialized form of the age, honestly very much like our streaming shows today. Charles Dickens uses it to expose the cruelty faced by the poor. The Bronte sisters write with this startling, isolated passion out on the moors. George Eliot tries to map out the dizzyingly complex web of society, and by the end of the era, Oscar Wilde is turning wit into an absolute art form.
Now for the shatter point. Chapter 5, The Shattered Modern World, Trauma and Fragmentation.
I want you to imagine everything we've built up so far just completely shattering. In 1914, the absolute trauma of the trenches in World War I broke the old ways of telling stories. Look at how drastically the rules changed. Traditional storytelling relied on linear time, objective narrators, and clear ideas of heroism and order. Those certainties were gone, completely destroyed. Furthermore, Einstein had just proven that time and space were relative, and Sigmund Freud was exposing the dark, irrational, unconscious mind. Writers realized they simply couldn't write the way the Victorians did anymore, so they created modernism. Fragmented timelines, shattered narratives, wildly jumping between minds and moments.
So, the crucial point is how they actually wrote this down. They relied heavily on the stream of consciousness. Instead of objectively describing what a character is doing from the outside, writers like Virginia Woolf and Mrs. Dalloway and James Joyce and Ulysses just poured their characters' raw, flowing, totally fragmented thoughts directly onto the page. They were literally answering the poet Ezra Pound's famous rallying cry for the age, "Make it new." They tore apart centuries of tradition to reflect a broken, highly mechanized world.
Finally, Chapter 6, Our Global Literary Conversation, The Restless Old Age.
This brings us to literature's restless, still unfolding old age. The horrors of the Second World War and the shadow of the atomic bomb were so incredibly vast that even modernism's fragmentation wasn't enough to process it. Writers developed a deep, lingering suspicion of any single right story or grand narrative of human progress. We get the theater of the absurd with Samuel Beckett. George Orwell gives us terrifying warnings of totalitarianism in 1984. But the absolute most beautiful shift here is how English literature expands. As the British Empire crumbles, these incredibly powerful post-colonial voices rise. Writers like Chinua Achebe and Salman Rushdie. English literature evolves from the story of one small, rainy island into a massive, diverse, worldwide chorus dealing with huge, global themes like identity, climate, and migration. Now, what's really interesting here is taking a step back to absorb this whole 1,500-year journey at once. We've moved from the heroic, deeply fatalistic chants in those old English mead halls to the confident drama of the Renaissance, the passionate rebellion of the Romantics, the anxious morality of the Victorians, the fragmented disillusionment of the modernists, all the way to our global, highly diverse contemporary chorus. It truly is a long, wildly fascinating life, constantly shaped by centuries of historical and cultural transformation. Which leaves us with this final thought. We are living in this exact story right now. The internet connects every reader to every writer globally, shifting the entire sociocultural landscape all over again. So, if English literature is a living story, what will the next chapter say about us? How will the literature being written today reflect our anxieties, our hopes, and our reality to the generations looking back 500 years from now? I'll leave you to ponder your own place in this massive, ongoing, living story. Thank you so much for exploring this with me today.